I remember the exact moment I realized I wasn't the only one in my marriage. It wasn't shouting. It wasn't lipstick on a collar. It wasn't even a late-night text. It was silence. The kind of silence that feels like something is breathing in the room with you, but you can't see it yet. I was standing in my own kitchen, barefoot, Sunday morning, gospel music playing low from my phone. I had just finished praying over everything God had given me, my marriage, my business, my peace. And then I saw it. A transaction. Not just any transaction. A transfer from my business account to an account I didn't recognize. At first, I smiled because I trusted him, because I trusted her, because I was the kind of woman who believed grace covered everything. I told myself, there's an explanation. There's always an explanation when you don't want the truth. But what I didn't know then was that this one moment, this quiet, almost forgettable moment was the beginning of the end of who I used to be, and the beginning of who I was about to become, because they thought grace made me blind. They didn't know grace was just patient. I am Naomi Clarke, and this is my story. But before I tell you what they did, I need to tell you who I was before they did it. Because you cannot understand the fire if you do not first understand the woman who carried the flame. I was raised in a household where grace was not a suggestion. It was a commandment. My mother, Claudette, was a Sunday school teacher in Atlanta, Georgia. She had a voice like warm honey and a faith like iron. She used to say, "Baby, the way you respond to wrong tells the world more about you than the wrong itself ever could." I believed her. I lived by that. I built my entire identity on it, and for a long time, it worked. I want you to picture me at 34 years old. I am standing in front of a storefront on Auburn Avenue in Atlanta, a building I've been saving for, sacrificing for, praying over for 3 years. The sign above the door reads Clarke & Co. Event Design. My name, my company, my dream made physical. I am wearing a caramel blazer, natural hair pinned up to one side, and I am crying not out of sadness, but out of the specific, overwhelming joy that comes when you have believed in something so long and so hard that when it finally arrives, your body doesn't know what to do with itself, except weep. My husband, Darius, is standing beside me. He is 6'2", dark-skinned, broad-shouldered, with a smile that could convince you the sun came up just to see him grin. He wraps his arm around me and says, "Baby, you did it. I actually did it." And standing on my other side, my best friend of 18 years, Renee Patterson. Small, bright-eyed, natural locks falling past her shoulders. She is screaming. Actually screaming, jumping up and down in her heels like a woman who has forgotten she's wearing them. "Oh my God, Naomi, this is yours! This is yours, girl! Those two people, those two right there. I want you to hold that image in your mind because you are going to need it later." Clarke & Co. did not start the way some businesses start, with investors and capital and pristine business plans. It started with me, a laptop, a second-hand printer, and a Google spreadsheet that I updated obsessively at midnight while Darius slept. I had been working in corporate event planning for 8 years. I was good at it. No, I was exceptional at it. I had coordinated fundraising galas for nonprofits, product launches for Fortune 500 companies, weddings that made it into magazines. I had a gift. I could walk into an empty room and see the event it wanted to become. I could translate a client's vision into something that made people walk through the door and stop breathing for a moment. But I was doing it for someone else's name, someone else's brand, someone else's legacy. So I left. My colleagues thought I was being reckless. My mother thought I was being brave. Darius said he supported me, and at the time, I believed him. He had a stable job as a sales manager for a logistics company, so we had something to stand on while I built. I was grateful for that. I said it constantly. I made sure he knew that his stability was the foundation I launched from. Renee became my unofficial creative director in those early days. She was a graphic designer by training, working freelance, so she had flexibility. She built my brand identity, the logo, the website, the social presence. She had an eye for beauty and I had an eye for structure. Together, we were something close to perfect. In year 1, Clarke & Co. made $42,000. In year 2, we made $118,000. By year 4, we had 6 full-time employees, a satellite office, corporate retainer clients, and a reputation in Atlanta's Black professional community that I cannot describe without sounding like I'm boasting. So I will simply say, if you were throwing an event in this city and you wanted it done right, you called Naomi Clarke. I brought Renee on officially in year 3 as creative director. I paid her well better than market rate because she was my best friend and because she had been there from the beginning, and because I am the kind of woman who believes in honoring loyalty. I brought Darius in during year 4 as business manager. His background in sales and logistics made sense on paper, and honestly, I wanted to build something with my husband. I wanted us to be the kind of couple that built an empire together. I had this vision of us, 20 years from now, turning the company over to our children, sitting on a porch somewhere, talking about the life we made. I know what you're already sensing, and you're right. But let me finish telling you who I was first, because that part matters. I was the woman who prayed before every major decision, who kept a gratitude journal, who hosted a Bible study in my home on Thursday evenings, who called my mother every Sunday without fail, who brought food to sick neighbors and remembered everyone's birthdays and sent handwritten thank you notes to clients and vendors alike. I was genuinely known for my grace. People would say it about me the way they might describe a physical feature. That's just Naomi. She's the most gracious person I know. And I was proud of that. I held it like a crown. But here's what nobody tells you about wearing a crown of grace in a world full of people looking for leverage. Some people see your grace and they're inspired. And some people see your grace and they start calculating. They look at your forgiveness and think she won't fight back. They look at your faith and think she'll chalk it up to God's plan. They look at your softness and think she'll never look too closely. Darius and Renee looked at my grace and saw an open door. I want to be fair. I don't think it started as a scheme. I think it started as rationalizations. The kind of small, quiet dishonesty that people commit when they feel entitled to something they haven't earned. A little extra here. A reimbursement that never happened. A vendor fee that was slightly padded. The kind of thing that's easy to do when you control the books and you're married to or best friends with the person whose name is on the door. But small dishonesty unchecked has a way of growing ambition. By the time I started noticing, which I will tell you about in detail because the moment is burned into my memory, it was no longer small. They had been siphoning money from Clarke & Co. for 14 months. And they had done it using my grace as their cover story. Darius, when questioned by vendors or employees about financial decisions, would say, "Naomi is focused on the creative side. She trusts me to handle this." Renee, when questions arose internally about budget allocations, would say, "You know Naomi, she believes in giving people room to operate. She doesn't micromanage." They were right that I gave people room. They were right that I didn't micromanage. But they made a critical error. They confused trust with obliviousness. And they underestimated what I do at 11 o'clock at night when the house is quiet, my tea is warm, and I'm alone with my laptop and the numbers that tell me everything I need to know about what is happening inside my company. I built this business from a spreadsheet. I never stopped reading the spreadsheets. It was a Tuesday in October. The kind of Tuesday that has no drama attached to it when it starts. I had a 10 o'clock client consultation, a 2 o'clock Teams sync, and a 6 o'clock dinner reservation with Darius at a restaurant he'd chosen, which I remember thinking was sweet because he had been so attentive lately. Bringing me flowers, coming home earlier, asking about my day with what felt like genuine interest. I understand now what that was. But I didn't understand it then. Then I just thought my husband was going through a season of intentionality in our marriage, and I was grateful. At around 9:15 that morning, before my client arrived, I opened the company's financial dashboard. Something I did every few days, not obsessively, just to stay oriented. I was looking for a specific vendor invoice that I needed to reference for a proposal. I didn't find the invoice. What I found instead was a line item in our operating expenses titled Strategic Consulting External. $12,000, paid out 3 weeks prior. I stared at it. I scrolled up. I scrolled down. I cross-referenced with our vendor list. There was no external consultant on our vendor list. There was no contract in our system for strategic consulting. There was no email thread, no proposal, no deliverable, no record of a conversation in which anyone had suggested we needed $12,000 worth of external strategic consulting. There was just the charge. I sat with it for a moment, and I want to be honest about what I felt in that moment because it was not anger. It was not panic. It was something quieter and colder than both of those things. It was the feeling you get when a puzzle piece clicks into place and you realize the picture it's making is not the picture you thought you were building. I closed my laptop. I went to my client consultation. I smiled. I was professional. I was warm. I was Naomi Clarke. And inside, very quietly, something was shifting. After my 2 o'clock sync, I went back to the dashboard. This time, I didn't look for the vendor invoice. I started from 6 months back and I read forward. Slowly, line by line, the way I used to read in the early days when every dollar was precious and every entry had to be justified. It took me 2 hours. By the end, I had found 19 line items I could not verify. They ranged from $2,000 to $18,000. They were spread across different expense categories: supplies, logistics, professional development, consulting. They were not clustered together in a way that would trigger an obvious alert. They were woven in deliberately distributed to blend with legitimate expenses. Someone had been careful. Someone who knew how I operated. Someone who knew that I reviewed financials periodically but not forensically. Someone who knew what categories I would question and which ones I would glance over. Someone who understood my business from the inside. The total across those 19 line items was $237,000. I put my pen down. I sat in the silence of my office with my name on the glass door and my mother's Bible verse framed on the wall, and my first client thank you card pinned to the bulletin board, and I breathed. My first instinct, the Naomi of 5 years ago, would have been to walk out of that office and confront the situation immediately. Would have called Darius, would have texted Renee, would have wanted an explanation right now today because surely there was one. Surely this was a mistake, a miscommunication, an accounting error. But I'm not the Naomi of 5 years ago. I am the Naomi who has sat in enough boardrooms, who has navigated enough contracts, who has dealt with enough difficult clients to know that the moment you reveal what you know, you lose the advantage of knowing it. So I did not call Darius. I did not text Renee. I closed my laptop, picked up my purse, drove to the restaurant, sat across from my husband, ordered the salmon, and talked about our weekend plans and whether we should repaint the guest bedroom. I laughed at his jokes. I held his hand across the table. I drove home beside him in a comfortable silence. And after he fell asleep, I lay in the dark next to him and I thought with a clarity that was almost spiritual in its precision about everything I was going to do next. There is a verse my mother used to say, Proverbs 31 verse 25, "She's clothed with strength and dignity, and she laughs without fear of the future." I used to think that verse was about attitude, about spiritual posture, about choosing joy. That night, lying in the dark next to the man who had been stealing from me, I understood for the first time that it was also a strategic instruction. Laugh without fear of the future because you have already secured it. There is something almost clarifying about the decision to stop reacting and start planning. The grief was there. Don't let me pretend it wasn't. In the weeks that followed that Tuesday, there were mornings. I woke up early before Darius and went to sit in the kitchen alone, and the weight of it would settle on my chest like something physical. 18 years of friendship with Renee. 12 years of marriage to Darius. Thousands of moments, birthdays, funerals, celebrations, ordinary Tuesdays that were now refracted through this new terrible understanding. But I did not have the luxury of collapse. I had a business to protect. I had employees who depended on that business. I had a legacy to secure, and most importantly, I had information. And information used correctly is power. The first thing I did 3 days after that Tuesday was call my attorney. Not the business attorney Darius knew about. I had a second one. A woman named Patricia Wells, who I had consulted 2 years prior on a contract dispute with a vendor. Patricia was meticulous, discreet, and she had the kind of quiet ferocity that doesn't announce itself until it needs to. I liked her immediately when I met her, and I had kept her card for reasons I could not have articulated at the time. Now I understood why I'd kept it. I met Patricia at her downtown office on a Wednesday morning, told Darius I had a client site visit. I sat across from her and I laid out what I had found, calmly, and as specifically as I could. She listened without interrupting. When I was done, she looked at me for a long moment and said, "How long ago did you find this?" 5 days, I told her. She nodded slowly. "And in those 5 days you haven't confronted anyone?" "No." Another pause. Then she said, "Good. That is exactly right. Do not confront anyone. Not yet, do you understand?" I told her I understood. She said, "Here's what we were going to do." And from that point forward, I had a plan. Patricia connected me with a forensic accountant, a man named Gerald Osei, originally from Ghana, now based in Atlanta, with 20 years of experience untangling financial fraud in small and mid-sized businesses. Gerald was precise in a way that I admired deeply. He did not deal in feelings or assumptions. He dealt in data, in documentation, in the clean, unimpeachable language of numbers. I gave Gerald access to every financial record of Clarke & Co., going back to the day Darius had formally joined the company. I gave him the payroll records, the expense accounts, the vendor contracts, the bank statements, every digital file, every scanned paper receipt. And then I waited. While Gerald worked, I kept showing up to my life. I showed up to the office every morning, steady and warm. I had my team syncs. I signed off on event proposals. I photographed installations and posted on social media with captions about gratitude and vision. I went to Bible study and led the discussion on forgiveness with what my group members told me later was unusual depth and power. I also began very quietly restructuring. Patricia had advised me early on to begin legally separating my personal assets from the business in ways that would be defensible, documented, and impossible to untangle retroactively. Some of this I could do openly. It was not unusual for a business owner to reassess personal and business financial structures. Some of it required more care. I opened new accounts. I had conversations with the business bank that Darius didn't need to be part of. I began moving certain assets and IP registrations, including the Clarke & Co. brand trademark, which was registered in both my name and Darius's, into structures where my ownership was singular and legally airtight. None of this was illegal. All of it was deliberate. Patricia reviewed every step. Meanwhile, I began keeping a personal record of everything I observed. Not in the company system, on a private encrypted document that lived on a personal device. I kept in a locked drawer at my mother's house. I recorded dates, amounts, observations, conversations, anything that seemed relevant, anything that might matter later. And I watched. I watched Darius. Not with suspicion painted on my face, with the calm, measured attention of a woman who was paying attention for the first time in a long time. And what I saw once I was truly looking was a man who had become accustomed to comfort he had not built. He carried himself differently than he had 5 years ago. There was an ease in him that I had read as contentment, but that I now recognized as entitlement. He ordered things without checking prices. He referenced plans I hadn't heard about. He had, at some point in the last year, upgraded his personal car without a conversation that I recalled having. I watched Renee too. And with Renee it was more complicated, because with Renee there was love, real, deep, 18-year love tangled up in the betrayal like roots in soil. You cannot remove one without disturbing the other. Renee was still fully herself with me, in most ways generous, funny, present, warm. She still called me every other day. She still brought me coffee when she came into the office. She still looked at me with what appeared to be genuine affection. But there were moments, small, almost imperceptible, where I caught something in her eyes. A micro-expression. A too quick subject change when finances came up in conversation. A fractional flinch when I mentioned reviewing vendor contracts. She knew what they had done, and she was living with that knowledge the way people live with things they have convinced themselves are survivable by not looking directly at them. I understand that too. I understand the architecture of self-justification. I have compassion for it even now. What I do not have is tolerance for what they did with it. 3 weeks into Gerald's work, he came to me with his first preliminary findings. We met at Patricia's office, neutral ground, formal space. Gerald set a binder on the table that was 2 inches thick. "Miss Clarke," he said, "I want to be direct with you. What I have found here is not ambiguous." He walked me through it. The full scope of it was worse than what I had found on my own. They had not only created false expense line items, they had created a ghost vendor. A consulting company called APC Strategy Group that existed on paper, had a bank account, had even a rudimentary website, and had been receiving payments from Clarke & Co. for 14 months. When you followed the money out of APC Strategy Group, it went into a personal account in Renee's name, from which Darius received transfers. It was sophisticated enough to require planning. It was not something that happened in a moment of weakness. It was built. It was maintained. Total documented theft, $308,000. Patricia asked me how I was feeling. I looked at the binder for a moment. "Clear," I said. And I meant it. The grief was still there. The grief would be there for a long time, probably. But in that moment, sitting in Patricia's office with a 2-inch binder of evidence on the table in front of me, I felt something that I can only describe as the peace that comes from knowing. Because here is what Darius and Renee did not know, could not know, had no way of knowing. I had been building towards something. Not revenge. I want to be precise about that because the distinction matters. Not revenge restoration. The restoration of what was mine, the protection of what I had built, and the dismantling of the fiction they had constructed. The fiction that my grace was passive, that my faith was naivety, that my forgiveness made me safe to exploit. I had one more piece to put in place before I was ready. And it required a conversation I had been both dreading and looking forward to in equal measure. It required a conversation with my mother. My mother, Claudette Barnes Clarke, is 71 years old and has lived in the same house in southwest Atlanta for 40 years. The kitchen smells like vanilla and cedar and old hymnals. There is a cross above the stove and a framed photograph of my late father beside the window. And the table, a heavy oak thing she has had since before I was born, has seen more serious conversations than I can count. I drove to her house on a Saturday morning. I told Darius I was going to help her with some yard work, and I was technically going to do some yard work. I just needed to do something else first. Mama had made biscuits. She always makes biscuits when she knows something is wrong, even before you've told her what's wrong. My mother has a gift for spiritual discernment that I have never been able to fully explain to anyone who doesn't share our faith tradition. She simply knows things. She knew when my father got sick before the diagnosis. She knew when I was having trouble in my marriage years before I admitted it to myself. She knew when I was carrying grief I hadn't named yet. She set a plate in front of me, sat down across from me, poured 2 cups of coffee and folded her hands. "Tell me," she said. So I told her. All of it. From the Tuesday in October to Patricia's office to Gerald's binder. I told her the amounts and the mechanisms and the ghost vendor and the transfers. I told her how long it had been going on. I told her what I had done since then. The accounts, the restructuring, the documentation. She listened the way she always listens, with her full body still and her eyes completely present, never looking away, never interrupting. When I was done, the kitchen was quiet for a moment. Outside, a cardinal landed on the fence post near the window. My mother looked at it briefly, then back at me. "How long have you known?" she asked. "About 6 weeks now." She nodded slowly. "And you haven't said a word to either of them?" "Not a word." She was quiet again, Then are you angry? I thought about it honestly. Yes, but it's a quiet anger. It doesn't feel like what I expected anger to feel like. That's because you're past the anger part, she said. You went straight through it into something else, into clarity. She reached across the table and covered my hand with hers. Claudette Clarke has hands that have worked hard all her life, strong, warm, slightly rough, and when they cover yours you feel held in a way that is almost cellular. Baby, she said, I need to ask you something and I need you to be honest with me. Always. Are you doing this right? Not in the legal sense, Patricia handles that. I mean in here. She touched her chest. Are you doing this from a place of peace or are you doing this from a place of bitterness dressed up in strategy? I sat with that for a long moment, because my mother does not ask questions she hasn't already thought through. Both, I said finally. At first, maybe more bitterness, but I've been praying, and I think it's shifted. I think what I'm protecting is real. I think what I'm doing is right. I'm not trying to destroy them, Mama. I'm trying to make sure they face the truth of what they did, and I'm trying to make sure my company survives it. She studied me for a long time. Then she nodded once, definitive. Then you're doing it right. She stood up and refilled my coffee. Then she sat back down and said, You know what people never understand about grace? I shook my head. They think it means you absorb everything. They think it means you have no edges, that you're soft all the way through. But real grace, the kind the Lord demonstrates, has a spine in it. You forgave those people in your heart before they ever knew they needed forgiving. But forgiveness is not the same as permission, and grace is not the same as surrender. She pointed at me across the table. You go do what you have to do, and you do it with your dignity intact and your faith in front of you. And when it's over, you pray for them genuinely, not performatively, and you move forward. But do not let anyone tell you that protecting what God gave you is unchristian. It is not. I cried then. For the first time since that Tuesday in October, I actually cried. Not from sadness, exactly from the specific relief of being fully known by someone who loves you fully. Mama came around the table and held me the way she's been holding me since I was 6 years old, and she said, You're not falling apart. You're getting ready. The day before I set everything in motion, I had what appeared to be an ordinary day. I want to walk you through it because I have thought about it many times since, and I believe ordinary days are sacred in a way we don't appreciate until we understand that every ordinary day is actually the last of something and the first of something else. I woke up at 6. I made coffee. I sat in the armchair by the window in our bedroom and read my devotional while Darius slept. The light was coming in through the curtains in that particular way. It does in late November, thin and golden and slightly mournful. I read Psalm 37. Do not fret because of those who are evil or be envious of those who do wrong, for like the grass they will soon wither, like green plants they will soon die away. Trust in the Lord and do good, dwell in the land and enjoy safe pasture. I closed the devotional and sat in the light for a while. At 9, I was in the office. I did a full walk through something. I did periodically, just to feel the space, to move through it and remember what it represented. I walked through the reception area, the design studio, the back office where Gerald had spent hours with our records. I stood in my own office and looked at the framed verse on the wall and the first client card on the bulletin board and the view of the street below, where Atlanta was going about its day, oblivious and beautiful. I met with my lead event coordinator, a woman named Shayla who had been with me for 4 years and who was meticulous and dedicated and who I was going to make a partner when this was all over. We talked about an upcoming gala, logistics, vendor timelines. She had coffee. I had water. We solved 3 small problems and identified 2 potential ones. It was a good meeting. At noon, I had lunch with Renee. This was perhaps the hardest part of that day of the entire preceding weeks, actually. Because Renee ordered her usual shrimp and grits from the place we'd been eating at since we were 22 years old. And she was herself. She laughed her real laugh. She reached over and picked a piece of bread from my plate without asking, the way she'd done 1,000 times. She talked about her niece's recital and a client project she was frustrated with and whether she should finally get a dog. I watched her and I felt it all at once, the love and the grief and the anger and the forgiveness all present simultaneously, like chords sounding together. I thought that this is the last lunch we will ever have that is not defined by what you did. And I was present for it, fully. I laughed at the right moments. I listened. I asked about the niece's recital with genuine curiosity. I was Naomi. Because here is what I understood. Sitting across from Renee that day, being present for that last ordinary lunch was not a performance or a disguise. It was a final act of love. I was giving us the US that had existed before the betrayal, one last hour of being what we were. After lunch, I drove home and sat at the kitchen table with my personal laptop, not the work one, and I sent 3 emails. The first was to Patricia, confirming that I was ready to proceed on Monday. The second was to Gerald, confirming that his documentation package was complete and requesting final copies. The third was to the HR attorney Patricia had connected me with, an iron-willed woman named Sandra, confirming our Monday morning call. Then I closed the laptop, made dinner, Darius's favorite jerk chicken and rice, and had the kind of quiet evening that people have when they're about to change their lives forever. Darius said the chicken was perfect. I said thank you. We watched television. I fell asleep on the couch and he carried me to bed, the way he used to do in the early years of our marriage, and I thought once this was real. Once we were real. The grief of that is not something I have finished with. I want to be honest about that. The grief of lost love is not resolved by strategy or by legal process or even by justice. It lives alongside everything else. But the next morning was Monday. And I was ready. Monday started at 7:30. I arrived at the office before anyone else, which was not unusual. I made a pot of coffee in the break room. I sat at my desk. I opened my laptop. I read back through every note I had kept for the past 8 weeks, not to inflame myself but to ground myself in what was true and documented and real. At 8 o'clock, Patricia and Sandra arrived. We had arranged for them to come in through the back entrance. They sat in the conference room with their materials. Patricia had the documentation binder. Sandra had employment termination paperwork. Both women were calm in the way of professionals who have done difficult things many times and understand that steadiness is a gift you give to the people who need it. At 8:45, my staff began arriving. I said good morning to each person with my usual warmth. I meant it. My staff was not part of this. They were protected. Their positions were secured. Sandra had helped me draft communication for them that would be delivered after the morning's events. Their paychecks would clear. Their benefits would continue. Clarke & Co. would continue. I had made sure of that. Renee arrived at 9. I heard her voice in the hallway. She was talking to Shayla about something, laughing. My office door was open. She put her head in. Morning, Nay. Good morning, Renee. Can you come to the conference room when you get settled? I need to talk through some things. Sure, give me 5 minutes. Darius arrived at 9:15. He was on his phone as he came in a call. He wrapped up quickly. He stopped at my doorway, phone pocketed. Morning, baby. Good weekend? It was. I need you in the conference room in a few minutes. Something moved briefly in his face, just briefly, before his expression resettled into neutral. Yeah, of course. Let me put my bag down. They both arrived in the conference room within minutes of each other, which meant they arrived together. Renee holding her coffee, Darius holding his phone, both of them stopping when they saw Patricia and Sandra already seated at the table. I was standing at the head of the table. The room went quiet. Renee said, Naomi, what is this? I said, please sit down. My voice was steady, not cold steady. There is a difference. Cold is disconnected, steady is present. I sat across from them, not at the head of the table anymore, which was deliberate. I wanted to be across from them. I wanted to be looked at. I said, I'm going to tell you what I know. Patricia is going to walk you through the documentation, and then Sandra is going to talk to you about your employment. Nobody needs to interrupt. Everything will be given to you in writing. Darius opened his mouth. I held up one hand. Please, let me finish. He closed his mouth. I looked at both of them. Really looked, the way I had not allowed myself to look in 8 weeks, because looking meant feeling. And I had needed to stay functional. I said I know about APC Strategy Group. I know about the bank account. I know about the transfers. I know about every line item going back 14 months. I have a complete forensic accounting report. I have documentation of every transaction. I have the total, which is $308,000. The silence in that room was absolute. Renee put her coffee down very slowly. Darius did not move. I said I also know that you used my reputation, my grace, as people call it, as the reason no one would question you. You told people I trusted you. You told people I didn't look closely. You used the person I have worked to be as your cover story. My voice stayed steady. It surprised me. It surprised them too, I think. I believe they had feared or perhaps hoped for a break-in. Tears, shouting, the kind of emotional confrontation that creates the possibility of manipulation, of mitigating, of bargaining. They did not get that. They got me steady and present and fully in possession of myself. I am not here to tell you that what you did is unforgivable, I said. That's between you and God, and ultimately between you and me over a longer period of time than this morning. What I am here to tell you is what happens now. Patricia opened the binder. Patricia is extraordinary in a conference room. She does not raise her voice. She does not gesture dramatically. She simply places information in front of people with the precision and the gravity of someone who understands exactly how consequential it is. She walked Darius and Renee through the documentation page by page, transaction by transaction. She named dates. She named amounts. She identified the APC Strategy Group account and traced the money flow. She presented the forensic accountant's full report, which had Gerald's professional signature and contact information at the bottom. Renee started crying at some point during this. She put her head in her hands and her shoulders shook, and I sat across from her and I felt, and I want to be precise again, I felt compassion. Not softening, not capitulation, compassion. Those are different things. Darius remained composed on the surface in a way that I recognized as performance. He was calculating. Even then, in that room with the evidence spread across the table in front of him, he was calculating. I knew him well enough to read it. When Patricia finished, Sandra spoke. She was brief and clear. Effective immediately, both Darius's role as business manager and Renee's role as creative director were terminated. Their access to company systems had been revoked at 8 o'clock that morning. Their personal effects from the office would be available for collection under supervision. All keys and access cards were to be surrendered today. Darius said, Naomi, can we talk? Just us. We will, I said, eventually, not today. I need you to hear my side of. Darius. I said his name quietly. There is documentation of $308,000. I understand that you may have feelings about how this happened and why. We will have that conversation. But not today, and not in a context where it changes what is documented. He looked at me for a long time, and I think in that moment he finally really understood that the woman sitting across from him was not the woman he had calculated she would be. That the grace he had relied on was not a passive thing. That it had a spine, as my mother said. That it had been present and watching and building long before this morning. He looked away first. Patricia presented the restitution terms. They were as follows: a formal repayment agreement for the full $308,000 structured across a defined timeline with interest and legal accountability. In exchange, I was not pursuing criminal charges at this time, a decision Patricia had counseled and I had considered carefully, knowing that criminal prosecution would mean public exposure, which would mean impact on Clarke & Co.'s reputation, which would harm my employees, my clients, and everything I had built. The restitution agreement was legally binding. Violation would trigger immediate referral to the district attorney. They were given time to consult their own attorneys before signing. Renee looked up from her hands. Her mascara was trapped down her face. She looked at me, really looked, and what I saw in her face was not defiance, not calculation, but something that looked a great deal like shame. The genuine kind. The kind that knows itself. She said, "Naomi, I'm so sorry." I looked at her. "I know," I said. And I meant it. I believed her. That made it more complicated, not less. Real betrayal is always complicated because it is almost never committed by people who are entirely without love for you. It is committed by people who loved you and chose something else anyway. That is the truth of it, and it is painful in a way that simple malice never could be. The meeting ended around 11 o'clock. Patricia and Sandra left. I walked them out and thanked them. Then I stood in the doorway of Clarke & Co. and watched them go to their cars, and then I turned around and looked at my company. My name on the glass, my mother's verse on the wall, my employees at their desks doing the work of building something beautiful. I had protected this, all of it. I went back to my desk and I had a 15-minute cry, a private, full-body release of 8 weeks of held breath. Then I washed my face in the bathroom, reapplied my lip gloss, and went to find Shayla to talk through the gala timeline. Because the company had events booked. The company had clients to serve. The company was going to be fine. I was going to be fine. The months that followed were not easy. I want to tell you that clearly because I think we do a disservice to real stories when we skip over the hard parts to get to the triumphant ones. Darius and I began what would become an 18-month separation leading to divorce. The legal process was complicated because our financial lives were intertwined in ways that took careful, methodical work to separate. Patricia was excellent throughout. I was grateful for her and for the foresight that had led me to protect assets before the confrontation. The divorce was painful in the specific way that the ending of something true is painful. Even when what it becomes is false, what it was real. I did not hate Darius. I grieved him. Grief and hate are very different emotional labor, and I refused to spend my energy on the latter. The restitution payments began according to the agreement. Both Darius and Renee retained attorneys, and both ultimately signed. The money began coming back. Clarke & Co. not only survived, it expanded. In the 12 months following that Monday morning, I hired 2 new senior designers, signed 3 new corporate retainer accounts, was featured in a national industry publication, and spoke at a conference for Black women entrepreneurs in Charlotte. I told a version of my story there, not the personal details but the strategic principle. The importance of understanding that grace and naivety are not the same thing, that faith and inattention are not the same thing, that forgiveness and permission are not the same thing. The room was very quiet while I spoke. Then a woman in the 3rd row started clapping, and it spread. And by the end I was standing in a standing ovation from 300 women who understood something about that particular truth in their bodies. "I made Shayla a partner, as I had planned," she cried. "I told her she had earned it." I found a new creative director through a national search, a young woman named Jordan from Houston, 29 years old, with a breathtaking eye and the kind of hunger that reminded me of myself at that age. She has been extraordinary. Renee and I have not spoken in depth since the conference room. There have been 2 brief exchanges, once when she called to apologize again, a longer, more considered apology that I listened to in full. And once when I called her, about 8 months later, just to tell her that I was doing well and that I hoped she was finding her way. I meant it. I still mean it. Forgiveness is not a moment. It is a practice. I'm practicing. My mother called me every Sunday, as always. One Sunday, about 4 months after the Monday, she said, "Baby, how are you, really?" And I told her, honestly, I'm tired, and I'm proud. And I'm sad sometimes, and I'm grateful all the time, and I think I'm going to be okay. She said, "That's not just okay, that's whole." I have thought about that a lot. Whole, not fixed. I was never broken in the way people might assume, but whole in the sense of integrated. In the sense that the parts of me I was told were weaknesses, The grace, the faith, the forgiveness turned out to be exactly the things that gave me the clarity to act correctly when the moment required it. I wore my grace like a vulnerability for too long. I let others define it as passivity, let others read my patience as obliviousness and my forgiveness as permission. The mistake was not in being gracious. The mistake was in believing that grace did not require strategy. Every great act of grace, every real one, not the performed kind, requires the actor to know what they're giving, to give it with full awareness, to understand its value, to be a willing participant in their own mercy, not an unwitting one. That is the difference between being gracious and being taken advantage of. And that is what I reclaimed on that Monday morning. Not just $308,000, not just my company, not just my name on the glass. I reclaimed the right to define my own grace. I am standing in front of Clarke & Co. again. 2 years, almost to the day since that first Tuesday in October. The sign is the same. My name is the same. The space is different. We've expanded into the building next door, knocked through the wall, created a showroom that I am genuinely proud of. The team is bigger. The work is better. The future is brighter than it has ever been. I am standing here thinking about what I want to say to you because I know you are out there. I know because every time I speak about any part of this story, I find you in the audience. You are the woman who has been told that her softness makes her a target. The woman who has been praised for her grace in a tone that also implied she could be handled. The woman who gives and gives and gives and has sometimes quietly in the dark wondered if she is being seen or simply being used. I have things I need to say to you. The first thing is this: your grace is not a weakness, but it can become one if you do not understand it as a power and manage it accordingly. Grace that is given without discernment is not a virtue. It is a failure to respect yourself. Real grace flows from strength, from wholeness, from the settled knowledge of your own value. It is not the absence of edges. It is the choice about when and how and with whom to deploy your softness. The second thing, your faith does not require you to be naive. The two have been falsely married in the messaging many of us received growing up, and it has cost us enormously. Faith is not the willingness to believe that people will do right by you against all evidence. Faith is the conviction that God will sustain you through whatever they do. Those are different things. One asks you to close your eyes, the other asks you to keep them open. The third thing, and this is the most important, documentation is an act of self-love. Know your numbers. Understand your contracts. Read your agreements. Keep your records. Not from a spirit of paranoia or distrust, but from a spirit of stewardship. You have been given gifts, skills, labor, vision, time. Those are sacred things. Steward them like the sacred things they are. The fourth thing, you are allowed to be strategic. You are allowed to be measured. You are allowed to take time before you respond. The culture around Black womanhood, and especially around Black Christian womanhood, has sometimes told us that the virtuous response is always immediate, always emotional, always forgiving, always giving the benefit of the doubt. But wisdom is also a virtue. Discernment is also a virtue. Patience that is strategic rather than passive is also a virtue. You are allowed to know things and not say them yet. You are allowed to wait. You are allowed to build the wall before you show them the door. And the fifth thing, the one I return to most often, the one my mother gave me, the one I want to leave with you. Forgiveness is not permission. Grace is not surrender. You can forgive someone truly, spiritually, genuinely forgive them in your heart and still hold them accountable for what they did. You can wish someone well and still make sure they face the consequences of their choices. You can release the bitterness without releasing the boundaries. These are not contradictions. They are the full picture of what righteous response looks like. I forgave Darius. I am forgiving Renee. I still have the restitution agreement. I still have Patricia's number. I still have my company, my name on the glass, my mother's verse on the wall. I have all of it. Not despite my grace. Because of what my grace actually is. I want to tell you one more thing before I go. About 8 months ago, I was hosting a corporate client dinner. Beautiful event. One of our best. Midway through the evening, I stepped outside for a few minutes to get some air, and I stood on the terrace looking out at the Atlanta skyline. A woman came out shortly after me. One of the clients, mid-50s, self-made, the kind of woman who has clearly navigated a great deal. We'd only exchanged brief pleasantries inside. She stood beside me and looked at the skyline for a moment. Then she said, "You built this company yourself, didn't you?" It wasn't a question. "Yes," I said. "I can tell," she said. "The ones who build it themselves, you can see it in the way they move through the space, like every part of it is theirs." I thought about that. I thought about the years, the sleepless nights and the spreadsheets and the October Tuesday and the conference room and Patricia's binder. I thought about my mother's kitchen and Shayla becoming a partner and Jordan's breathtaking eye. I thought about everything it cost. And I said, "Yes, all of it is mine." She nodded. "Good," she said. "Make sure it stays that way." I looked at her and smiled. And I meant it. The smile, the peace behind it, the certainty. "I intend to," I said. And I went back inside. To my company, to my name on the glass, to the life I built, reclaimed, and am still building stronger now than it has ever been, and more fully mine than anything I have ever held. My name is Naomi Clarke. And this is what happens when you mistake my grace for weakness.